Hello again, I'm Greg. And as promised in another video, the first of the writing workshops, we're going to take a more focused look at the political aspect of sexuality in literacy, its presence in various educational venues, the problem of the scope and function of what a school library is, all of those kinds of things. And I remember, some years ago, I had a quite an intimate conversation with one of the founders of the grassroots organization Moms for Liberty in the United States. This was with Tiffany Justice, a very well-spoken and interesting woman. And one of the things that she brought up was just sort of a pragmatic sensibility. This, whether this is the thin edge of the wedge, of course, we don't yet know. I'm sure that critics such as Penn and the American Library Association, who see these parental groups as in some ways their enemies, they probably think that this is a PR spin. I did not get, just to be absolutely honest, I did not get that feeling from Ms. Justice that this is what this was. And this pragmatic point was one that we're going to examine in this essay and this analysis was that, okay, what are school libraries for? Are they really for exposing young people to everything? Or are they more really about specific learning outcomes, right? And there was this sense, of course, that, if you wanted to access other material, there were other venues where that material could be found, like the public library, for example, or online, or you could buy it at a bookstore. And we'll look at all of those things. And to me, that seemed at least a very salient point, right? It's not. It gave me the impression that this sort of folderol is not just about, okay, I'm offended, or maybe I have a more conservative sensibility than other people, or it's okay if you want your kids to read erotica at age 10, hey, that's your choice, but I don't want my kids doing that. So yes, all of that is probably involved somewhere, but at the same time, I wonder if there isn't a more pragmatic point to this, and we'll try to explore some of that here. Okay, so this piece is called Sex and Literacy Separated at Birth, and it runs the following. And I'm going to make some remarks doing so. I'm not just going to read something to you again, but we'll begin with that. Given the ongoing folderol surrounding sexual content in school libraries and indeed many other spaces wherein representations of sexuality are present, it behooves us to examine not only the claims made by the antagonists, politicians and parents groups mostly on the one side, and authors and literary and library organizations in the main on the other, in a word, not very many people either way, but the more so, why such claims are appealing in the first place. Politics is notoriously susceptible, but also beholden to the often whimsical or even irrational sensitivities of the wider polis. And, just to nod to our sense that this kind of conflict can be seen as a latter-day town and gown affair, the subjective and also political bases upon which those in the book industry and the culture industry more widely defend their wares. So, on the one hand, we have, some people who are obviously interested in limiting access. And then on the other, at the very sort of bare bones of it, we're interested, we have people who are interested in selling units, right? So the more venues they can get their stuff into, the more sales they can do. And Ms. Justice also informed me of something that I was dimly aware of, because I've worked with many, many publishers, obviously, over the years, but I'm not in the publishing industry myself. Obviously, I'm just an author, just a writer to that regard. And so what she told me was that very often publishers offer bulk deals to school districts and to schools, and you're being sold 50 books, and you really only have noted that you really want 20 of them or something like that, or that maybe you do want the vast majority of them, but then there's some other ones thrown in, as it were, in the package. So this is interesting. This is not something that I was aware of. Okay. At base, we have a product that vested interests desire to sell, coming up against a power which must sustain itself by pandering to its extent franchise, and perhaps also by hoping to extend it. Okay, so there's business and government. Sex sells, to be sure, but apparently so does prudishness. In itself, the confrontation is most uninspiring and tells us little about either sex or literacy, and the less so about how they are themselves related. So, let's see if we can dig into both the sources and effects of this popular panic. When I was 12, I had matriculated in my reading from the gentle adventures of Enid Blyton to the more gritty affairs of C.S. Forester, Frederick Forsyth, Jack Higgins, and Jean le Carré, for example. In the early pages of The Odessa File, 1972, Forsyth gives us a mock rape scene. So this is Frederick Forsyth's novel, The Odessa File. I recall it now, almost a half-century later, because it made an impression upon my youthful mind. Some women actually like that sort of thing, I asked myself at the time. Its placement in the rising action is, of course, a tip-off that the protagonist is going to be facing down the difference between theater and reality, given he is soon thereafter pressed into hunting down a secret SS benevolent society. The novel asks the reader to consider the character of violence, both in person and in society, and in that, its formula pulp thriller framework ascends into a more literary space. In the hands of a wordsmith, whatever their genre or audience, sex, like violence, can be used to nudge the reader into reflection, as well as for both character and plot development. The question here is not about the presence of such scenes, but rather their purpose. The censors are concerned only about the first. This is understandable because it is a delicate matter of interpretation regarding whether or not one can reasonably suggest that this or that scene of intimacy or cruelty, and the more so, the both of them at once, is substantive or merely vicarious. We could simply use the rubric of author status in the literary canon to adjudicate, but this would miss a surfeit of other authors, including myself, who are at least competent, and thus not out to abuse either the reader's taste or their literacy. What we find is rather the opposite occurring. If only the most bland accounts of the human condition remain on the menu, our ability to digest reality will correspondingly narrow. Reading a censored library is rather like having one's pancreas on the fritz. At the same time, publishers seek to sell units, and, as with other commodities, a key feature in successful marketing is snatching a loyal franchise when it is young. Certainly from age 12 onwards, sex was on my mind, only retreating indeed quite recently. Young people are ripe for sexual exploration and encounter, and print media is merely one venue wherein they can accomplish both. To cast a wider net for a moment, it is clear that the nettlesome presence of sexuality in our society is far more pervasive than a few graphic novels, of late betraying the double entendre of their genre category, discovered by an equally few parents in a school library in Edmonton. We do value intimacy as well as desire pleasure, and thus sexuality is itself commodified to a certain extent, simply because the demand always seems to outstrip the supply. It is at least mildly annoying for anyone of middle age and older that youth are so fully in touch with not only their abilities but also their appetites. It is this general and holy phase of life-related resentment which, in some cases leading to ressentiment itself, contains the germ of censorship regarding sexuality. Forsyth's depiction of sexual violence, combined with another early recollection in my own reading career, that of David Westheimer's casual yet desperate scenes of rationalized murder in Von Ryan's Express, a novel from 1964, which I read also at age 12, and this gave me a sense that the adult world was rife with both lust and vengeance. Many of my own characters in my works of fiction suffer from an intense conflict between their sense of justice and their need for vengeance. The one inheres from our ideals, the other from our realities, and, as the latter oft falls so short of the former, there exists conflict in our shared world. Not long thereafter, I recall reading two further thrillers, both of which were concerned with the ability of personhood to overcome retributive violence before it consumed them. In The Orcas, a novel from 1982, Thomas H. Cook presents an unflinching private diary of an SS death camp doctor hiding from the world in some unnamed Latin American nation. Much more of a literary piece than most thrillers, the narrative plunges headlong into the very depths of the human psyche. It is the apocalypse writ small. But the same story is told on an ultimate stage in A Passing Advantage from 1980. Here, Mark McGarity calls attention to our ability to rationalize violence on the largest scale known. But the fact that it is still a human being who pulls the trigger is not lost on the reader. That I was reading in my that I was in my teens reading these kinds of books did not at the time suggest either an unease or a dis-ease, one manifest of the homeless mind. Yet I am much more hesitant today, approaching 60, if someone asked me whether or not I would recommend any of my youthful reads to the same aged youth today. So here I am. I'm going to be 60 quite soon, and so I have this sense, and perhaps somebody out there is going to accuse me of becoming a conservative or even a reactionary. There's a sense that, if somebody who was 12 today said, hey, what were you reading when you were 12, 13, 14, etc., and I say, okay, I was reading these books, would I actually recommend those books to someone 12 now? Somebody would say, well, why not? You read them. What's the difference? But at the same time, I have to take a step back from that. And honestly, I'm not sure whether I would say, okay, yeah, here, grab these books, etc. Now, here's a kind of interregnum here before we carry on. I've had readers as young as 13, even though publishers' age recommendations for my adventure fiction is 14 plus. Okay, so what have I done? I've checked with the parents in both cases and say, hey, there's some hair-raising content in here. How literate is your 13-year-old? How mature are they? I like to be kind of involved, at least incipiently, before saying, okay, yeah, I think that you can handle it. And then, one of the moms, who was a colleague of mine, said, oh, she reads the same stuff that I do. So then it was like, okay, well, if that's the case, then go for it, right? Knock yourself out. And then in the other case, the case that's ongoing is I'm mentoring in a writing workshop series, somebody who is also 13. So then they're reading this stuff, and there's been absolutely no problem. But are these the average 13-year-olds, right? And that's a question that, I don't think it should be left for parents groups or special interest groups to ask, but it's also a question that educators have to ask in general. Okay, so what is the going rate out there? And people who are in the schools and probably have a better sense of that because they're seeing en masse numerous people of the same age. Okay, and they can do a compare and contrast, sort of by definition, if you will. I personally wouldn't know, right? I mean, my sensibility as an educator and as a pedagogue, of course, are people who are quite a bit older, right? From age 17 to 25. And by that age, you should be able to read anything. This is not a case of sort of the tender years, as it were. This is not a case of preserving some strange fantasy of innocence or romance of innocence. But these are people who are learning to kind of confront the reality of the world and so need to have access to its entire expression of itself, warts and all, as it were. Okay, so let's continue for a moment. So this is perplexing, given that I as well write most of my own fiction for youth first, and adult market only secondarily. As with any author, every reader is precious to me. At once, I want youth to encounter their own nascent humanity, but as well, through the lens of similarly youthful characters created by someone whose own youth is long lost. Does this necessary disconnect in turn bring both perspective to the writer, in that I now have enough experience to better judge what might be placed on the literary menu for young readers, and the readers, in that they are avidly and imploringly in need of experience, or does it do an inevitable disservice to both? If the brass tacks of censorship is about power versus market, then surely the human experience thereof is more nuanced. Let us consider two passages from my own work, wherein appears the kind of scene censors might take umbrage at. The first comes from my recent novel, The Replacement, where the heroine first engages with her new best friend. Okay, so these are two yet different intimate scenes than we explored and analyzed together in the longer video about the writing workshop regarding how to write good sex scenes. Okay, so here's a couple of other ones. This is from the novel, The Replacement. I want to kiss you, but it'll have to wait. That truly is a shame, but I knew her action was not at all about hooking up or even companionship. This was their team's version of rehab, and I was in desperate need of such. So much so that I decided not to continue discussing the EEG results, whatever they might mean, and just waved to the other two, who gave Claire and I a look of unknowing askance. Too damn bad, people. This is what I need now, and every bit of it. Claire, you sweet, lovely thing, you. 21 and doing your Master's of Science, huh? I didn't even look at Max's house, did not run up the front entrance to greet and thank his wife, but rather let Claire lead me by the arm, hurriedly and passionately, through the basement back door and onwards. I cautioned myself against my own strength, also novel, as she pulled me down and into her very selfhood. Speaking of a more welcome amnesia, I woke next to her naked form, myself without a stitch, not that I'd been wearing hardly anything in any case, with the sunlight flickering in. Her love-making flooded back to me like the high tide of revelation. She was clearly not a veteran, which might itself have spoken to her sudden ardor. Even so, I delved right in, and, with a great sense of relief and gratitude, far more than even desire, allowed her to take me wherever she was herself bound. I, in turn, lingered long with my tongue in the centres of where such supplicants' lips and mouths should ever linger, sending her beyond the feigned rapture of the infidels and well into the uncharted terrain of the Gnostic. Ever uncharted, with fitting irony, for to map such a landscape would to be invite just anyone thither. Her lips were a portal, her folds the sacred limon, her linen the dressage of mounted victories, her hymen the hymnary of heraldic heroine, her clitoris the crested mount of Mons Olympus, and thence my tongue the traveller's twice-told tale, venturer and adventurer, infestrix of each vestibular vox humana, her soft cries making me swoon the more, goading me like a welcome whip, so welcome and welcoming, and giving me climax apart from her caress. How long we were together in these sidereal scenes I never knew, but upon sated completion sleep had been the only equal force. Okay, so what's the problem with that scene? Let's sort of try to imagine that now from the person who's kind of critically examining this kind of content in books that young people have access to. Okay. Apart from the use of the terms such as hymen and clitoris, there doesn't seem to be much a censor could complain about this passage. For some, of course, two young women making love might be offensive, or that the heroine, who is just shy of 16 at this juncture, would thus not be quite legal for someone 6 years her senior. But the narrator is in fact an old soul, and coming of age is for her more of a return to form than a voyage of patent self-discovery. In a word, context matters, and it is just this that appears to be absent in the censor's mindset. Okay, a second example now, from my most recent novel, Silent Covenant. This is also a different scene than the one that I shared with you and analyzed in the workshop. Here, the scene is wherein an unknown and possible impostrix has seduced one of her predecessor's closest friends. I have the name of the hotel Philip has booked. I hope you do not mind sharing a room with me, as long as I shall not be underfoot. I want to love you, Emma, if of course this does not offend thee. Tasha hummed this out in a soft dulcet. She seemed entirely unmoved by airing such a thing out, as they themselves had moved into the more core districts. The Jaguar was purring now, not roaring, as it had done in free flight across the countryside, not unlike its namesake, Emma imagined. Yes, such imagery as that anything to delay responding to this utterly unexpected remark. It was no entreaty, assuredly. Tasha was clearly someone who could simply have anyone she wanted, and at any time. But she has chosen me. Why so? Well, for my part, I'm single, of course. I haven't even had dinner with Hawk, and here I was inviting him into our midst. I'm pining for Ames, am I not? No. Not quite that. I'm pining for companionship. As stated, Pens doesn't seem to need it, or if she does, she doesn't care. For someone like her, the old song lyrics chanting about money duly apply elsewhere, and damn the torpedoes, as the Yanks like to say. I don't know what to say, Tasha. You're miles superior. Allow me to prove your nonsense true, as in a dreamscape. Is that what all of this is? There are moments in which I feel it to be so. That is only because your entire life has been as dreamy. Who, Emma? Who else could have won such a happenstance lottery? You cannot know anything about it. Emma was careful not to spit this out. On the contrary, I know everything about you, simply by having been graced with your ongoing presence. The way you carry yourself. It was not your ancient Celtic looks that hooked me into sharing you with Philip. A good photographer looks past the window dressing. It was, rather, my, shall we say, comportement. Ha! Bad word. But perhaps I prefer a more basic eloquence. Your whole being speaks of the noble, Emma, your body, your face, your form, your function, and that is why I shall make love to you. Make to love you, at least this night. Emma repressed a gasp. Tasha was presuming upon her consent, but had done so in a manner that even a Don Juan might have fumbled. Her own femininity was only a part of it, for Emma had been blindsided in the most gracious and loving way imaginable. It was as if a former lover, one whom Emma had regretted to lose, and had dreamed about reuniting with, had suddenly and indeed reappeared, and thus fulfilled all of the fantasies she had manufactured during her mourning. And so it was that the two women were together in the manner of all lost loves, uniting in their desires, yes, but finding the higher unity through their mutual vision. Yet afterwards, lulling herself to sleep beside this impossible presence, Emma found she had lost sight of her star, and did search in vain for her compass. So here, we find even less to rattle our puritanical sensibilities, and yet the reader's imagination is still taken to where it needs to go. In a word, there are 1,000 ways to write a sex scene, but only a few good reasons for actually doing so. In this, representing sex is the same as is sex itself. As tempting as it would be to simply ask the censors about their own sex lives, perhaps so focused upon the family as they may be, one would in turn have to reduce their opponents to the same kernel. Is it truly the case that Margaret Atwood only defends literacy and education because she has made it 1,000,000 times? Such possibilities aside, one can at least suggest that the two sides have contrary views on the expanse of the human experience that should be shared with youth. Though this may be derived from their own personal experiences, the force of political suasion it musters to itself is much more profound. The censor seeks to speak on behalf of all. It is this that puts their claims out of court to court, and not the specific content of their argument. Now, it must be said that as an author and as a philosopher who specializes in both ethics and education, I would not only not wish for the vast majority of my titles to be placed in school libraries. In fact, I can think of only 3. That's 3, right? Well, now 4. It starts to sound like Monty Python, right? You know, this like the Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition. We have 3 ways. No, we have 4 ways. Anyway, in fact, I can think of only 4 out of 68, right? That would be quote unquote appropriate, okay, to use that language, to be placed in school libraries, especially elementary and middle school libraries. Okay, so that's like a tiny minority of even my own output, right? I would also remind youthful readers that all of these apparently sensitive titles are readily available elsewhere: the public libraries, ebooks, bookstores, and in print through the internet, and even, copyrights respected or no, simply in digital form, free to be read by that same all. Why then cannot teachers simply refer to these titles in this or that pedagogic moment and send their charges thither? Certainly youth today is more than capable of finding sources, especially since almost everything is itself noted digitally. So we must then ask, is there something of principle at stake when authors who do specifically write for children make a claim to archival space internal to the education system? It is perhaps too easy to erect the formula lattice of freedom of expression joined to freedom of inquiry. Yes, curious young minds want to know, and less curious older minds sometimes do not. But if all materials, no matter how titillating, are readily available of the wider world in any case, what is the basis for inserting them into mere institutional spaces of youthful learning? I think this is warmer. Adults know that when one leaves school behind, one tends to stop learning very much of anything. This is both a guttering indictment upon our social leanings as a whole, but also presents an unreasonable demand upon schooling itself. Is it also then the case that our general resentment of youth might well include our lack of opportunity or yet ability to learn? There's a question for us, right? How many adults read books of any sort? It is a rare thing indeed for my wife and I to visit friends and see any sign of a library at hand, of any scope or focus. A quick perusal of physical books for sale outside of dedicated bookstore retail spaces tells of an incredibly narrow bandwidth of what is available, as if books were akin to types of rice or yogurt. Yet would not any specialist, say, in fishing gear or hardware, scoff at a box store's representation of their craft or vocation? How is the written word truly different from any other set of detailed commodities? In capital, it is not. For all, including ourselves through our labor power, are commodities. In itself, however, there could not be more of a difference. The book is a record of the soul of the species. Its species being, to stay with Marx for a moment, is expressed in the written word, just as language is, as a whole, the essential manifest of its character. Each tome its own human manifesto, each reader thus, and thenceforth one who, fire-inspired, trespasses the ipsissima sanctuary of all thought and feeling, reason and passion, memory and anticipation. Is it sage to deny youth the keys to such a realm, when at once we fully expect them to become the very future of its contents? Yes, perhaps leaven this language, so potent as to overwhelm the heart and mind of the most intrepid among us, and so that a 12-year-old is not unknowingly knocked about by the widest world, and all at once. But no, and never seek to prohibit the learning of that self-same language, the source of all that has been human, and more importantly, all that may yet be so. Thank you.